My husband looked straight into my video call while another woman lay against his chest. My 82-year-old mother needed the hospital, and he smiled like I had interrupted his evening. That was the moment my marriage ended. Not in a courtroom, not with lawyers sitting around a polished table. It ended in the glow of a phone screen inside a small office on Fort Campbell while rain tapped against the window, and my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. My name is Rebecca Carter. I was 45 years old then, a logistics officer with the U.S. Army stationed near the Kentucky-Tennessee line. I had served 22 years long enough to know how to stay calm when everything inside me wanted to break apart. That Tuesday started like any other. I was at my desk reviewing transport schedules, drinking burnt coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's Okayest Soldier." Around 6:42 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mrs. Darlene Price, my mother's neighbor in Franklin, Tennessee. "Rebecca," she said, breathless, "your mama's on the kitchen floor. She says her chest hurts." For 1 second, the whole room went quiet. My mother, Margaret Ellis, had lived alone since my father passed. Stubborn as a fence post, sweet as church pie, and proud enough to argue with the pharmacist over $5. She was 82, but she still folded her own laundry, watered her roses, and watched Wheel of Fortune every night at 7. I stood up so fast my chair hit the wall. "I'm coming," I said. But I wasn't coming, not right then. Our unit was under an emergency lockdown after a base-wide security issue. Nobody was leaving without clearance, not even officers. I walked straight to my commander's office anyway. He looked at my face and knew before I spoke. "Carter," he said softly, "I'm sorry, I can't release you yet." So I did the only thing I could do. I called my husband David. He was at our house outside Nashville, less than 30 minutes from my mother. I called once, no answer. Twice, no answer. Then I tried video. He picked up on the 4th ring. At first I saw the ceiling fan, then his face, then her. A younger woman with dark hair was curled up beside him, her hand resting on his shirt like she belonged there. My own living room was behind them. The blue quilt my mother made was folded over the couch. "David," I said, swallowing hard, "Mom needs to get to Vanderbilt. I'm stuck on base. Please go get her." He didn't move. The woman glanced at him, then at the screen. David sighed like I had asked him to take out the trash during a football game. "That's not my problem," he said. "Figure it out." I stared at him. No yelling came out, no crying, nothing dramatic. Just one word. "Okay." Then I ended the call and sat there with the phone in my lap, listening to the rain, knowing 2 things at once. My mother might die tonight, and my husband had already chosen who he was. I wish I could tell you I had a backup plan ready. I didn't. The moment I ended that call, I stared at my contacts list, trying to think clearly while my heart pounded. My mother lived alone in Franklin, and I was nearly an hour away even without the lockdown. Every minute felt heavier than the last. I called my cousin Linda, straight to voicemail. Then my old high school friend Denise. No answer. My mother's pastor was leading Bible study. The church office had already closed. I even called a rideshare service in Franklin, hoping someone could pick her up, but Mrs. Price told me Mom was too weak to walk outside alone. "Rebecca," she whispered over the phone, "she's trying to stay brave, but she's fading." I covered my face with my hand. After spending more than 2 decades solving Army logistics problems, I couldn't solve the one that mattered most. Then I remembered Harold Jenkins. Harold had delivered mail on my mother's route for almost 30 years before retiring. He still stopped by every few weeks just to check on her, usually bringing tomatoes from his garden, or asking if she needed anything from Lowe's. I found his number in my mother's emergency contacts. He answered after 2 rings. "Rebecca, everything all right?" "No." I admitted, my voice cracking for the first time. "Mom collapsed. I can't get off base." There wasn't even a pause. "I'm on my way." No questions, no excuses, no complaints. Just those 4 words. Mrs. Price called me 25 minutes later. "Harold's here." I could hear the front door opening. Then Harold's calm voice. "All right, Margaret, let's get you to Vanderbilt." My mother tried to protest. "I don't want to bother anybody." Harold chuckled. "You've been bothering me since Jimmy Carter was president. One more day won't hurt." Even through my tears, I smiled. That sounded exactly like him. Another 45 minutes crawled by before my phone rang again. This time, it was a doctor from Vanderbilt University Medical Center. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes, your mother is stable. She experienced a mild heart attack." I leaned against the wall outside my office. The doctor continued. "The good news is Mr. Jenkins got her here quickly. Had she arrived another hour later, the damage could have been much worse." Another hour. Those words echoed in my head. Another hour. I thanked the doctor until I realized I was saying it over and over. When the call ended, I finally let myself cry. Not loudly. Just enough to empty everything I'd been holding in. A young sergeant walking by quietly set a fresh cup of coffee beside me without saying a word. Sometimes kindness doesn't need an explanation. Around 9 that evening, I checked our joint credit card account to make sure I could cover whatever medical bills were coming. One charge caught my eye immediately. The Oak Steakhouse, downtown Nashville. $214.87. Timestamp 7:18 p.m. The exact time my mother was being admitted to the emergency room. I stared at the receipt details. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, dessert. While Harold, a retired mail carrier in his 70s, was rushing my mother to the hospital, my husband had been enjoying filet mignon with the woman I'd seen on my phone. He never called to ask whether Mom survived. He never texted, not even once. I locked my phone, took a long breath, and looked out through the rain-covered window toward the runway lights. For the first time since we married, I stopped wondering how to save my relationship. Instead, I started thinking about how to protect the life I'd built before he destroyed what was left of our marriage. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. That wasn't unusual. Army life had trained my body to wake before dawn, even on the rare mornings when I could have slept another hour. What was unusual was the vibration coming from my phone. It wouldn't stop. I reached over from the narrow barracks bed, expecting another update from Vanderbilt. Instead, my screen lit up with a wall of notifications. David 38 missed calls. 21 voicemails. A dozen text messages. For a second, I honestly thought something terrible had happened to my mother overnight. My hands went cold as I dialed the hospital. A nurse answered almost immediately. "Mrs. Ellis had a comfortable night," she said warmly. "Her blood pressure looks much better this morning." I closed my eyes in relief. "So, she's okay. She's tired, but she's doing well." After thanking the nurse, I finally looked at David's messages. The first few sounded irritated. "Rebecca, answer your phone. We need to talk." "This isn't funny." By the 10th voicemail, his voice had changed. "Rebecca, please call me back." By the 20th, he sounded scared. "I don't understand what's happening." The last voicemail barely sounded like the same man. "Please, just answer once." I set the phone down without responding. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to solve one of David's problems. Instead, I made myself another cup of coffee in the tiny shared kitchenette and called the one person who mattered. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom said, sounding weak but unmistakably herself. "You should be resting." "I've been resting since yesterday," she teased. "They're feeding me oatmeal. I think that's punishment." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in days. "I heard Harold stayed until almost midnight," I said. "He refused to leave until the doctor talked to him." That sounded exactly like Harold. Mom grew quiet for a moment. "Rebecca." "Yeah, I know something's wrong. Mothers always know, even at 82, even from 100 miles away." I looked out the barracks window toward a line of Black Hawk helicopters parked in the distance. "I'll tell you everything when I get there." She didn't press me. She simply said, "All right." About 20 minutes later, another call came through. This time, the name on the screen surprised me. Linda Morgan. David's mother. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." Her voice sounded nothing like the confident woman I'd known for nearly 20 years. "Rebecca." She hesitated. "What exactly did you do?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "David called me before sunrise." She lowered her voice. "He's saying all your joint accounts are frozen." I stayed silent. "He says his credit cards were declined this morning." Another pause. "He couldn't pay for gas." I stirred my coffee slowly. Linda continued. "The bank says they can't discuss the account with him." She sounded genuinely confused. "Rebecca, what's going on?" I took a sip before answering. "Nothing." She waited. I said nothing else. Because the truth was, nothing dramatic had happened overnight. No secret phone calls. No revenge plot. No emotional confrontation. I had simply finished the paperwork I should have completed months earlier. Right after ending that video call while sitting alone in my office, I had logged into the secure legal portal I'd been given during an estate planning meeting the previous year. I submitted the divorce petition, exactly as my attorney had instructed me. Everything else had happened automatically. David just hadn't known it yet. As I ended the call with Linda, my phone buzzed again. "David, call number 39. I watched it ring. Then I quietly turned the phone face down on the table. For once, his emergency wasn't mine. When people hear a story like mine, they usually assume I spent the night plotting revenge. I didn't. The truth is much less exciting. I was simply prepared. About 11 months before everything fell apart, my father passed away after a long battle with Parkinson's disease. Losing him forced my mother and me to sort through decades of paperwork, insurance policies, deeds, bank accounts, retirement records. It was exhausting, and more than once we discovered things that should have been updated years earlier. After Dad's funeral, my attorney Karen Whitmore in downtown Nashville gave me a piece of advice that stuck with me. "Rebecca," she said, folding her hands across her desk, "you've spent over 20 years in the Army. You deploy, you travel. You need an estate plan whether you're happily married or not." At the time, I laughed. David would never let anything happen to me. Karen smiled politely. "I'm not questioning your marriage. I'm protecting your future." Looking back, she was doing exactly that. Over several appointments, we created a revocable living trust. The house David and I lived in, the small lake cabin my father had left me near Center Hill Lake. My investment accounts and even the consulting business I hoped to start after retirement were transferred into that trust. Karen explained every document carefully. "If you ever become incapacitated while deployed, everything is already organized." It made perfect sense. I signed every page. David didn't come to a single meeting. Whenever I asked if he wanted to join me, he'd wave me off. "You handle paperwork better than I do." I never imagined that sentence would matter someday. Back in the present, I finally returned Karen's voicemail during my lunch break. "Rebecca," she answered. "First, how's your mother?" "Recovering." "I'm glad to hear that." She paused. "I also received confirmation from the court this morning. So everything went through." "It did." Karen's voice remained calm and professional. "The divorce petition has officially been filed. Per the trust agreement and the financial protections we established last year, your trustee temporarily suspended access to all jointly authorized discretionary accounts until the property division is finalized." I looked out across the motor pool where soldiers were loading equipment onto flatbed trucks. "So David really can't use any of those accounts?" "Not without your authorization." I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. Mostly I felt tired. Karen continued. "I know this is difficult, but I want to remind you of something." "What?" "You didn't punish him." I frowned. "He created the circumstances. The legal documents simply did what they were designed to do." There was a difference. A big one. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to David. I was protecting assets that had always been legally documented assets I had inherited, purchased, or established long before he understood how they were titled. Later that afternoon, another voicemail arrived. David again. This time he sounded more confused than angry. "Rebecca, my debit card got declined at the grocery store." A few minutes later came another. "The bank says they can't explain anything." Then another. "My truck payment didn't go through." Another. "The mortgage website locked me out." I listened to each message without saying a word. What David didn't know was that the mortgage had never actually been in his name. Neither had the lake cabin. Neither had the investment account he loved bragging about to his friends. He'd spent years assuming we owned everything together because I'd never corrected him. Not once. I wasn't hiding anything. He simply never cared enough to ask. By early evening, Karen emailed copies of every filing for my records. I saved them in a folder, shut my laptop, and walked outside the barracks. The Kentucky sky was turning orange as helicopters crossed the horizon. For the first time since that terrible video call, my breathing felt steady again. I still had a long road ahead. My mother needed me. A divorce wasn't easy. And I knew David wouldn't give up quietly. But one thing had become crystal clear. He had mistaken my silence for weakness. He was about to learn the difference. By Friday afternoon, word had spread through David's side of the family that something was terribly wrong. I didn't know the details at first, because I had stopped answering every call except those from my mother, the hospital, and my attorney. The silence felt strange. For years, I'd been the one smoothing things over, returning messages, making excuses, fixing problems before they became disasters. This time, I let people sit with their questions. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang again. "Harold? Thought you'd want an update," he said. "How's Mom?" "Better every day. She complained about the hospital coffee this morning." I laughed. "That means she's feeling like herself." "It sure does." There was a pause. "I also saw your husband. That caught my attention. He stopped by your mama's house." "What happened?" Harold chuckled softly. "He knocked for about 5 minutes. And your mama looked out the window, saw it was him, and turned the television volume up. I couldn't help smiling. She actually did that. Oh, she absolutely did. Harold lowered his voice like he was sharing neighborhood gossip. He stood on the porch holding flowers, stayed there almost 20 minutes. I pictured David standing under my mother's porch light, probably rehearsing apologies that had arrived 2 days too late. Did Mom say anything? Not a word. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while. I wasn't happy that David was hurting, despite everything we'd shared nearly 18 years together. You don't erase that overnight. But I also knew flowers couldn't undo what he'd said when my mother needed help the most. Later that evening, another unexpected call came. This time it was my friend Monica, whose husband worked at the bank David used. She laughed before she even finished saying hello. "I probably shouldn't know this," she said, "but your husband has been all over town today." "What do you mean?" "He started at his bank." That didn't surprise me. Then he drove to the mortgage office. I leaned back in my chair. They couldn't help him either. "Nope," she continued. "Then he went to the county records office. Now I was curious. Why there? I guess he wanted to check the deed on the house." I closed my eyes. "And," Monica couldn't hide the amusement in her voice, "he apparently discovered your name is the only one listed as trustee." I didn't answer. "I wasn't trying to pry," she said more gently. "I just figured you'd want to know. I appreciate it." After we hung up, I stared at the family photo sitting on my desk. It had been taken at Percy Warner Park 3 summers earlier. David had his arm around my shoulders. Mom was smiling between us. Back then, I believed we were building a future together. Now I wondered how long he'd been pretending. The next morning, Linda called again. This time she sounded exhausted. "Rebecca." "Yes." "David came by my house at 6 this morning." I waited. "He wanted to borrow money." That surprised me. "He said everything's tied up." Linda sighed heavily. I asked him one question. "What did you ask?" I said, "David, what happened that made Rebecca file for divorce without even speaking to you first?" She stopped for a moment. He wouldn't answer. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she said something I never expected to hear. "I know my son." Another pause. "And when he won't answer a simple question, it's because the truth makes him look worse than anyone else's version." Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. For the first time, someone from David's own family wasn't defending him. They were starting to see the man I'd been trying not to admit existed. And David was only beginning to realize that losing access to money was the smallest consequence of what he'd thrown away that Tuesday night. By the following Monday, I finally received permission to take emergency leave. It wasn't much, just 5 days. Still, after nearly a week of feeling trapped behind the gates of Fort Campbell, climbing into my SUV and driving south toward Tennessee, felt like I could finally breathe again. The familiar stretch of I-24 looked different somehow. Maybe it was because my life had changed while I was still wearing the same uniform. Halfway to Nashville, Karen called. "You're headed home." "I am." "Good, there's something you should know." I slowed as traffic thickened near Clarksville. "What happened?" "David hired an attorney." I wasn't surprised. "That's his right." Karen laughed softly. "Apparently his attorney expected this to be a straightforward divorce. And he asked for copies of the trust documents." I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Karen continued. "I sent exactly what the court requires." "What did he say?" There was a brief silence. From what I heard, the meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. I couldn't help smiling. "Why?" "Because your husband spent years believing he owned things he never legally owned." I looked out across the highway. "I never lied to him." "I know." "He signed every tax return." "I know." "He never once asked how the property was titled." Karen chuckled. "Exactly." We said goodbye and I kept driving. About an hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Karen. It was a number I didn't recognize. Normally I would have ignored it. Instead, I answered, "Rebecca." A young woman's voice. "Nervous?" "Yes." "My name is Ashley." I said nothing. "I think we need to talk." There was a long pause before she continued. "I didn't know." I pulled into a rest area and parked. "What didn't you know?" "I didn't know David was still married." I closed my eyes. She hurried on. "He told me you were separated." That part didn't surprise me. He said the divorce was basically finished. Another pause. "He also told me," she hesitated, "that he owned several properties." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was painfully predictable. Ashley took a deep breath. "I found out yesterday that none of it belongs to him." Now I understood. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because her fantasy had fallen apart. He promised we'd move into the lake house this summer. The lake house belonged to my father, I said quietly. I know that now. She sounded embarrassed. He even showed me pictures. I remembered those pictures. Dad fishing at sunrise. Mom reading on the dock. Family barbecues every 4th of July. David had been showing off a life he hadn't built. Ashley spoke again. My parents met him last month. I frowned. They loaned him $15,000. That caught me completely off guard. For what? He said he was waiting for some investments to clear. I leaned back against the seat. And now, my father wants his money back. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Ashley sighed. I packed my things this morning. You moved out? Yes. She laughed bitterly. Turns out living with a man who lies to everyone isn't as romantic as he made it sound. For the first time since she called, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Pity. She sounded young. Maybe 30. Old enough to know better. Still young enough to believe a charming man who always had an explanation. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I don't expect forgiveness. I appreciate the apology. And she hesitated again. I sent your attorney every text message he ever sent me. I blinked. You what? I figured you deserved the truth. Within minutes, my phone chimed. Karen had already forwarded the email. Screenshots, dates, messages, photos. There it was in black and white. David hadn't started lying the night my mother had her heart attack. He'd been living a double life for nearly 9 months. As I pulled back onto the interstate, I realized something important. David hadn't lost Ashley because I exposed him. He lost her because eventually every lie runs into the truth. And the truth almost always arrives when people least expect it. Crossing the Tennessee state line had never felt so emotional. For 22 years I'd driven those roads wearing the uniform of a soldier. This time I was driving home as a daughter first. The October trees along Interstate 24 had just started changing colors. Reds and golds stretched across the hills, the kind of scenery my mother always insisted was prettier than New England. You don't have to go to Vermont, she'd say every fall. God already painted Tennessee. When I pulled into the parking lot at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, I sat in my SUV for a minute before getting out. I wasn't preparing myself to see Mom. I was preparing myself not to think about David. Inside the cardiac unit, I found Mom sitting in a chair by the window instead of lying in bed. She was wearing a pale blue robe and reading the newspaper through the same pair of glasses she'd owned for at least 10 years. She looked up. There you are. I crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped my arms around her. She hugged me back just as tightly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she leaned back and smiled. You look tired. I've had a rough week, I noticed. That made me laugh. She reached over and patted my hand. I wasn't talking about your face. No. You forgot to color your gray hair. I touched the silver streak near my temple and shook my head. Thanks, Mom. I raised you. I'm obligated to keep you humble. For the first time in days, the hospital room felt warm. Later that afternoon, the cardiologist explained her recovery plan. Medication. Light exercise. A healthier diet. No more lifting 50-pound bags of birdseed, he added with a smile. Mom pretended to be offended. I only lift 40-pound bags. The doctor laughed. I'll take that as progress. She was discharged the next morning. Instead of taking her straight home, I stopped at Elliston Place Soda Shop in Nashville. It had been one of Dad's favorite places. Mom ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup. I thought hospitals were supposed to improve people's cooking, she joked after the first bite. I nearly choked on my sweet tea, laughing. For a little while, life felt almost normal. When we finally reached her little brick house in Franklin, Harold was already there, replacing a broken porch light. He waved when he saw us. Figured you two didn't need another thing to worry about. Mom shook her head. You've done enough already. Harold smiled. I haven't even started collecting payment. Mom frowned. What payment? I expect at least 2 pecan pies by Thanksgiving. She laughed so hard I worried she'd tire herself out. I suppose I can arrange that. As I carried Mom's overnight bag inside, I noticed a bouquet of wilted flowers sitting in the trash can beside the porch. Those from David, I asked quietly. She nodded. He came back yesterday. What did he want? To apologize. And I told him I was too busy recovering. That sounded exactly like my mother. She looked at me carefully. Rebecca. Yeah, don't let hatred move into your heart. I looked away toward the backyard where Dad used to barbecue every Sunday afternoon. I don't hate him. No. No. What do you feel? I thought about the question for a long moment. Finally, I answered honestly, I don't think I know him anymore. That afternoon, while Mom rested in her favorite recliner, I unpacked groceries, watered her roses, and folded laundry that had piled up during her hospital stay. It felt peaceful, simple, exactly the kind of ordinary day I'd been missing. I almost believed the hardest part was behind me. Then my phone buzzed. It was Karen. "Rebecca," she said without even saying hello, "I think you should know, David just filed a response." "What kind of response?" She sighed. "He isn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He hired a private investigator." I stood completely still. "And I have a feeling," Karen said quietly, "this is about to get a lot uglier." Karen wasn't wrong. Things got uglier, but not in the way David expected. The following Monday, I met Karen at her office just off West End Avenue in Nashville. She slid a thin folder across her desk. "This is what his attorney filed." I opened it. Most of it was routine legal language. Then I found the accusation. According to David, I had emotionally abandoned the marriage because of my Army career. He claimed I had spent years choosing deployments, training, and promotions over my family. I read the paragraph twice. Then I looked at Karen. "He's blaming the Army." "He is." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. For years, David had encouraged every promotion I earned. He'd proudly introduced me as my wife the Army officer at neighborhood cookouts. He'd posted photos of my promotion ceremonies on Facebook. Now those same years had become his excuse. Karen folded her hands. "The good news is claims are easy. The truth takes a little longer." I nodded. "And the truth usually has paperwork." That made both of us smile. Over the next several days, David began calling relatives I'd barely spoken to in months. Apparently, he told everyone the same story. Rebecca cared more about the military than her marriage. Rebecca left me alone. Rebecca became cold. For a day or two, some people believed him. I couldn't even blame them. They'd only heard one side. I had no interest in calling everyone to defend myself. Instead, I focused on helping Mom settle back into her routine. Every morning, we drank coffee on her back porch. I'd refill the bird feeders while she read the newspaper. She still complained about politics. Still watched the squirrels steal seed from the blue jays. Little by little, life felt familiar again. Then Saturday morning changed everything. Harold stopped by carrying 2 grocery bags. "I brought tomatoes," he said. "And gossip." Mom smiled. "I knew there'd be gossip." Harold sat down at the kitchen table. "I ran into your husband yesterday." Neither Mom nor I interrupted. "He was talking to 3 people outside First Community Bank." Harold scratched his chin. "Sounded like he was telling them Rebecca left him because she loved the Army more than her family." Mom rolled her eyes. Harold continued. "I couldn't help myself." "What did you do?" I asked. I walked over. Mom smiled before he even answered. I said funny because when Rebecca's mother had a heart attack, I was the one driving her to Vanderbilt while David was somewhere else. I couldn't help laughing. "What did he say?" Harold grinned. "Nothing. Nothing." He turned around and walked away. Mom laughed so hard she had to grab her chest. "Careful," I said. "I'm laughing under doctor's orders," she replied. The following afternoon, another neighbor knocked on Mom's door. Then another. People weren't bringing gossip anymore. They were bringing casseroles, homemade bread, flowers. One woman I'd never even met hugged me. "We heard what happened," she said quietly. "We're sorry." I realized then that David had underestimated something important. Small towns have long memories. People knew who had been checking on my mother all these years. They remembered seeing me mow her lawn on leave, taking her to church, driving her to doctor's appointments. They also remembered who usually wasn't there. Late Sunday evening, Karen called again. "I've got something you'll appreciate." "What is it?" "Your husband's attorney requested hospital records." "Why?" "To challenge the timeline." "And?" Karen laughed. "They confirmed everything. Hospital admission, emergency treatment, arrival time. Even Harold's name appeared in the intake notes as the person who brought Margaret Ellis to the emergency room. One simple document erased every lie. David thought louder stories would win. He forgot that facts don't have to raise their voices. And for the first time since all of this began, I had the feeling that the truth was finally catching up with him. The court scheduled our preliminary settlement conference for the second Thursday in November. Karen warned me it probably wouldn't be dramatic. "Most of these meetings aren't," she said. "People exchange documents, negotiate, and go home." She was right. At least in the beginning. The conference room inside the Williamson County Courthouse was smaller than I'd imagined. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a long table with pitchers of water that nobody touched. David was already there when Karen and I walked in. He looked different, not older, just worn out. The expensive watch he never stopped showing off was gone. So was the tailored sports coat he usually wore. He glanced at me. I nodded politely. Nothing more. For nearly an hour, both attorneys discussed finances, timelines, and property records. David barely spoke. Then his attorney cleared his throat. My client believes Mrs. Carter's military obligations created an emotional separation that contributed significantly to the breakdown of the marriage. Karen calmly slid a folder across the table. We'd like to submit additional evidence before addressing that claim. David frowned. What evidence? Karen didn't answer him. Instead, she handed copies to everyone in the room. Phone records, hospital admission records, time-stamped credit card transactions. David shifted uncomfortably. Then Karen spoke. At 6:42 p.m., Mrs. Carter received a call informing her that her 82-year-old mother was suffering what was later confirmed to be a heart attack. She turned another page. At 6:58 p.m., Mrs. Carter initiated a video call to Mr. Morgan. David stared at the table. At 7:03 p.m., Mr. Morgan declined to assist. Another page. At 7:18 p.m., Mr. Morgan used the party's joint credit card to purchase dinner for two at Oak Steakhouse in downtown Nashville. The room became very quiet, Karen continued. Meanwhile, at 7:46 p.m., Harold Jenkins transported Margaret Ellis to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. David's attorney slowly lowered his pen. No one interrupted. Karen wasn't finished. We also have written statements from Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Darlene Price, attending medical staff and neighbors who confirm the timeline. David finally looked up. They're twisting everything. Karen remained calm. Then perhaps your client can explain why he chose dinner over helping his 82-year-old mother-in-law during a medical emergency. David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. For the first time since our marriage began falling apart, silence wasn't protecting him. It was exposing him. After a short recess, everyone stepped into the hallway. I walked toward the courthouse vending machines to buy a bottle of water. Someone called my name. Rebecca. I turned. Linda. David's mother. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she held a folded tissue in one hand. I've been wanting to tell you something. I waited. I didn't know. I know. She shook her head. No, I truly didn't know. Her voice cracked. When David told me you left him because of the army, I believed him. She looked down at the floor. Then Karen let me read the timeline. A tear rolled down her cheek. I raised my son better than that. For a second, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered the words I never expected to hear. I'm sorry. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. This wasn't your choice. No. She looked toward the conference room where David still sat with his attorney. But now I have to live with knowing it was his. When we returned inside, the mediator quietly suggested a short break before negotiations continued. As everyone gathered their papers, I caught David looking at me. Not with anger, not even with regret. With the expression of someone who had finally realized that every shortcut, every lie, every selfish decision had led him to this exact chair. And there was no easy way out anymore. After the break, the atmosphere in the conference room had changed. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a folder on the table. The loudest sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Sometimes the truth doesn't need drama. It just needs enough daylight. The mediator looked around the table. Mrs. Carter. He said, "Would you be willing to discuss settlement terms?" I nodded. Karen slid a single folder toward me. We had already talked through every possible outcome. I wasn't there to punish David. I wasn't trying to take everything he had. I simply wanted to end the marriage fairly and permanently. Karen spoke first. My client will retain the assets already held in her family trust. David's attorney nodded. We understand. My client is not seeking spousal support. Another nod. Each party will remain responsible for his or her own personal debts. Again, no objection. David hadn't expected the meeting to go this way. He kept looking from Karen to his attorney, almost waiting for someone to rescue him. Finally, he spoke. So that's it, Karen answered calmly. That's it. He frowned. I thought she'd try to ruin me. I looked at him for the first time that afternoon. Quietly, I said, I never wanted to ruin you. He stared back. I wanted a husband I could trust. The room fell silent. No one had anything to add. The judge reviewed the settlement several weeks later. It was brief, professional, orderly. When everything had been signed, the judge looked over his glasses. I wish both parties the best moving forward. Just like that, 18 years of marriage officially came to an end. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no television cameras, no cheering crowd. Real life rarely works that way. There was only cold November air and leaves blowing across the courthouse steps. Karen shook my hand. You handled this with remarkable grace. I didn't always feel graceful. She smiled. Most people don't. As she walked toward her car, Harold pulled into the parking lot in his old white pickup. He rolled down the window. So, I laughed. So, it's over. He grinned. Good. Good. You've got better things to do. He wasn't wrong. Instead of celebrating, the three of us drove to Vanderbilt to visit Mom. She'd insisted on baking pecan pie that morning, despite strict instructions to take it easy. The smell filled the whole house. Harold walked in carrying vanilla ice cream. I brought the important part. Mom pointed at him. I made the important part. For the first time in weeks. Nobody mentioned David. We talked about Thanksgiving. About whether the Titans had any chance of making the playoffs. About Harold accidentally backing his truck into his own mailbox the previous month. I was looking at a deer, he explained. Mom laughed. The mailbox wasn't moving. I noticed that a little late. Even I laughed until my sides hurt. It felt wonderful. Not because I had won, because normal life had returned. Later that evening, after Harold left, Mom and I washed dishes together. She dried each plate carefully before putting it away. You know, she said softly, your father always told me something. What was that? When people show you who they are, she looked at me. Believe them the first time. I smiled. Dad was a smart man. He usually was. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. For what? You didn't let bitterness become your future. I looked around the little kitchen where I'd grown up. The same oak table. The same curtains. The same home where my parents had spent nearly 50 years together. I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. Justice isn't always getting even. Sometimes it's simply refusing to carry someone else's mistakes into the next chapter of your life. People sometimes ask me what happened to David after the divorce. The honest answer is, I don't really know. And after a while I stopped wondering. For months I measured time by court dates, attorney meetings, and paperwork. Once the divorce became final, something unexpected happened. Life grew quiet again. Not lonely, just peaceful. I retired from the Army 8 months later. My retirement ceremony took place at Fort Campbell on a cool spring morning. The same parade field where I'd stood through promotions, deployments, and homecomings now marked the end of 23 years in uniform. As I looked across the formation, I saw familiar faces. Young soldiers I'd once mentored. Friends who had become family. My commander handed me my retirement flag. Major Carter, he said, smiling, thank you for your service. I accepted it with both hands. For the first time in years, I didn't have to wonder where I would be sent next. Home was finally home. A few weeks later, I moved into the lake cabin my father had left me. It wasn't fancy. Just a small place overlooking Center Hill Lake. Every morning I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch fishermen launch their boats before sunrise. The quiet became something I looked forward to instead of something I feared. Mom came to visit almost every weekend. Her strength slowly returned. She insisted on helping in the garden even though her doctor told her not to overdo it. I survived a heart attack, she'd say with a grin. I'm not going to lose a fight with tomato plants. Harold still stopped by from time to time. Sometimes he'd bring fresh vegetables. Sometimes he'd just sit on the porch and tell stories about his years delivering mail. One afternoon I asked him something that had been on my mind for months. Why did you come so quickly that night? He looked genuinely surprised. Rebecca. He set down his coffee. Because you asked. I smiled. No other reason? He shrugged. When people spend their whole lives showing up for everyone else, somebody ought to show up for them once in a while. I never forgot those words. Not long after retiring, I started volunteering with a local nonprofit that helped drive elderly veterans and seniors to medical appointments. The work wasn't complicated. Pick someone up. Take them where they needed to go. Wait. Bring them home safely. Every time I helped someone into my car, I thought about that rainy Tuesday evening. I couldn't be there for my own mother, but someone else had been. Now I had the chance to become that person for somebody else's family. Looking back, I realized my story was never really about revenge. It wasn't about frozen bank accounts, or divorce papers, or the woman sitting beside my husband during that terrible video call. Those things mattered at the time, but they weren't the lesson. The lesson was much simpler. The people who truly love you don't disappear when life becomes inconvenient. They show up. Sometimes they're family, sometimes they're lifelong friends, and sometimes they're a retired mail carrier who never hesitates when someone needs help. If you've ever had someone quietly stand beside you during one of the hardest seasons of your life, I hope you've had the chance to thank them. And if this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take care of the people who show up for you and be that person whenever you can. The end.